Richard Davenport lived in a world of his own making, a world built of glass and steel, of stock market victories and boardroom takeovers. His mansion wasn't a home, it was a monument to his success, perched on a hill overlooking the city that he felt in many ways he owned. The floors were Italian marble, so polished you could see the distortion of your own worried face in them. The walls were adorned with art that cost more than most people's houses, yet they brought no color to the rooms. The air itself felt expensive, filtered and sterile, carrying the faint, clean scent of antiseptic that clung to everything. It was a fortress, but it wasn't designed to keep intruders out. It was designed to keep a single, unbearable truth locked in. Her name was Ilara, his daughter, his only child, the one thing in his life that hadn't come with a price tag, and the one thing he couldn't fix now that it was broken. Ilara was 20 years old, and for the last 364 days, she had been silent. She lay in a state-of-the-art medical bed, installed in what used to be her art studio. The vibrant canvases she had once painted were now covered in white sheets, like ghosts of a life that was. The only colors in the room now were the flickering green and red lights of the monitors that tracked her every breath, her every heartbeat, her every flicker of non-existent brain activity. A car accident, a cruel twist of fate on a rainy night, had stolen her from him. It had left her body perfectly preserved, a sleeping beauty in a glass coffin of modern medicine, but her mind, her spirit, was gone, lost in a fog that no neurosurgeon in the world could navigate. Richard's days had a grim, unchanging rhythm. He'd wake before dawn, his mind already churning through corporate strategy, but the first thing he did was walk to her room. He would stand in the doorway, a titan of industry reduced to a helpless spectator. He'd look at the charts, the readouts, the data. He understood data. Data was logical, you could analyze it, find patterns, create solutions. But Ilara's data was a flat, cruel line. It was the absence of information. It was a full stop at the end of a beautiful sentence. He would speak to the round-the-clock nurses, his voice clipped and precise. Any change? The answer was always the same. A gentle shake of the head, a look of pity he despised. Pity was a currency he had never traded in. He had flown in specialists from Zurich, Tokyo, and Johns Hopkins. He had funded experimental therapies and invested in radical new technologies. He had tried to buy a miracle, throwing millions at the problem with the same aggressive confidence he used to acquire a rival company. Each time a new expert would walk the polished marble floors, study the charts, and speak in hushed, somber tones. They would use words like persistent vegetative state, unlikely, and acceptance. Richard would write the check, show them the door, and the silence in the house would grow a little louder, a little heavier. He rejected every suggestion that deviated from cold, hard science. Acupuncturists, spiritual healers, mystics, he saw them all as vultures, circling his grief, looking for a weakness to exploit. He had built his empire on logic and control. He would not surrender to what he called sentimental nonsense. He saw his daughter's condition as a complex engine that had stalled, and he just hadn't found the right mechanic yet. He refused to believe the engine was broken beyond repair. He refused to believe that some things, the most important things, were simply beyond his control, beyond his immense, suffocating wealth. He stood there now, at the end of another long day of failed strategies, both in the boardroom and in this sterile, quiet room. He looked at Ilara's peaceful, unchanging face. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, making the room feel even colder. He had conquered the world, but he couldn't cross the few feet of empty space to reach his own daughter. He had built a fortress of grief around them both, and its walls were getting higher every single day. He was beginning to fear he would never find a way out. Miles away from the sterile fortress on the hill, the city breathed a different kind of sadness. The rain wasn't gentle. It was a persistent grey curtain that washed the life from the streets, turning reflections on the pavement into blurry, abstract paintings. People hurried along, heads down, collars up, lost in their own worlds of muted struggle. Beneath the arches of an old stone bridge, safe from the downpour, a man was having a conversation. His name was Leo, and he was speaking with a language older than words. He was speaking through his cello. The instrument was old, its wood dark and scarred with the stories of 100 other rooms, 1,000 other melodies. It was his only companion, He wasn't playing for the few damp dollar bills that lay in his open case. The people who rushed by were just shadows. He was playing to the rain. He was playing for an audience of ghosts. His eyes were closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The music that rose from the cello wasn't a performance, it was a confession. It was a deep, resonant prayer, a sound that spoke of loss but also of a stubborn, quiet strength. The notes didn't just hang in the damp air, they seemed to push back against the cold, weaving a small pocket of impossible warmth under the cold stone bridge. At that exact moment, Sarah was walking home. As Ilara's head nurse, she carried the silence of the Davenport mansion with her. It was a heavy weight in her chest, a constant hum of humming machines in her ears. Another 12-hour shift had ended the same way it began. With no change, she felt the despair seeping into her own bones, a professional empathy that was becoming personally exhausting. She was just passing the bridge, her umbrella a flimsy shield against the city's gloom when the sound reached her. It stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a single, sustained note, so full of profound emotion that it felt like a physical touch. She lowered her umbrella, letting the rain mist her face, and listened. She had heard the world's greatest orchestras on the expensive sound system in Richard's study. This was different. This wasn't technical perfection. This was truth. This was the sound of a human heart, exposed and vulnerable, singing its story into the uncaring world. As Leo played, weaving a melody that was at once heartbreaking and uplifting, a memory sparked in Sarah's mind. It was from before the accident. A sunny afternoon in the garden. Ilara, her face bright with life, describing her favorite instrument. "A cello doesn't just play notes, Sarah," she had said. "It breathes. It sounds like the soul itself is singing. The soul itself is singing." The words echoed in Sarah's head, colliding with the music pouring from under the bridge. An idea began to form. A wild, reckless, completely unprofessional idea. An idea that would, in all likelihood, get her fired on the spot. Selm. Davenport, with his cold logic and his army of specialists, would laugh in her face. He would call her a fool. He would see it as a desperate, pathetic grasp at straws. And maybe it was. But as she stood there, mesmerized by the lone musician, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a year inside that mansion. It wasn't logic, it wasn't science, it was hope. A fragile, trembling, irrational hope. What was the alternative? More doctors with somber faces, more nights watching a flat line on a glowing screen, more of Richard Davenport's heart turning to stone from the sheer force of his own grief. The music swelled, a crescendo of defiant beauty against the rhythm of the falling rain. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She would face the Titan in his fortress. She would risk her job, her reputation, everything for the ghost of a chance, for a memory of a girl who loved the sound of a cello. She turned away from the bridge, the musician's melody burned into her mind, and began walking back the way she came. The door to Richard Davenport's study was a slab of dark, imposing mahogany. To open it without being summoned was to breach the walls of the inner sanctum. Sarah stood before it, her heart hammering against her ribs, the melody from the bridge still echoing in her soul. She took a breath, turned the cold brass knob, and stepped inside. Richard was at his massive desk, a fortress in itself, bathed in the cool glow of a computer monitor, displaying stock tickers in a frantic, silent dance. He didn't look up. "What is it?" The words weren't a question. They were a dismissal. He was a king in his court, and she was an interruption. "Mr. Davenport," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to speak with you about Ilara." That got his attention. He swiveled his leather chair around, his eyes, tired but sharp, fixing on her. "Has there been a change? Did Dr. Miller call back?" "No, sir. There's been no change in her condition." Sarah clasped her hands in front of her to keep them from trembling. "This is about a different approach, something we haven't tried." A flicker of interest was instantly extinguished by suspicion. "I have approved every therapy with even a 1% chance of success, regardless of cost." "What are you talking about?" Here it was. The precipice. "I was on my way home tonight," she said, speaking slowly, carefully, "and I heard a musician, a cellist. The music he was playing, it was profound. I remembered what Ilara once told me about how much she loved the cello. I believe hearing it, live in her room, might reach her. A silence descended on the room. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the heavy, charged silence before a storm. Richard stared at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. He slowly took off his reading glasses, polished them with a cloth, and set them down with deliberate precision. It was a gesture of performative disbelief, a theatrical way of showing her how absurd he found her words. "A musician," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Let me see if I understand this correctly, nurse. After I have spent millions on the world's leading neurologists, after I have equipped this house with technology that rivals a hospital, you are standing in my office proposing that the solution is a man playing a wooden box. It's more than that, sir. The way he played—" He cut her off, his voice rising, dripping with scorn. "And who is this maestro? Is it Yo-Yo Ma? Did you get a member of the Philharmonic to agree to a house call? He's a street musician, sir." The words hung in the air, and then it happened. The laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy or humor. It was a low, sharp, cruel sound. A sound designed to cut, to belittle, to utterly demolish her. He leaned back in his chair and laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, that's perfect. It's just perfect. A street musician, a beggar. You want to bring a beggar into my daughter's room to what? Play a magic song that wakes her from the dead?" He mocked the very idea, his voice a venomous parody. "And I'm sure he told you, my music will wake your daughter right before you offered him my money." The cruelty of it stung, but Sarah held her ground. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. The laughter died down, leaving a smirk on his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed this foolish, sentimental notion. "His music felt like hope," she said quietly. "And his name is Leo, not beggar." She added one final thing, the memory that had driven her back here. "And she loved the cello." Richard's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Sarah's words, "she loved the cello," had bypassed the fortress walls of his logic and his anger. They hadn't hit the CEO. They had hit the father. It was a memory, a flicker of Ilara, laughing, her hair falling in her eyes as she tried to describe a piece of music she'd heard. He had been busy that day, half listening, nodding while he scrolled through emails on his phone. The memory was a ghost, and it stung with a sudden, unexpected regret. He pushed it down, burying it instantly under a fresh layer of cold authority. He would not allow sentiment to rule him. He stood up and walked to the vast window overlooking the rain-slicked gardens. He turned his back on her, a classic power move, leaving her to stare at his imposing silhouette. For a moment, she thought he was going to simply order her out of the room, but the gear in his mind was turning. The idea was still absurd, an insult to his intelligence, but Sarah's quiet, stubborn defiance had presented him with a different kind of challenge. She wasn't just suggesting a therapy, she was questioning his worldview, a worldview where problems were solved by power, money, and data. She was proposing a solution based on a feeling. He saw it now, not as an intrusion, but as an opportunity to prove his point in the most definitive way possible. He would let this little drama play out. He would allow the street musician into his house. He would let him play his sad little song. And when the inevitable, crushing silence followed, when absolutely nothing happened, he would have an undeniable, real-world example of how foolish and dangerous this kind of thinking was. He would excise this sentimental cancer from his house once and for all. It would be a clinical trial, with a sample size of 1 and a predetermined outcome: failure. It would be a lesson, and he would be the teacher. He turned around slowly, his face now a mask of condescending magnanimity. "Fine," he said, the word dropping into the silent room like a stone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You are so convinced. You have so much faith in this fantasy. Let's put it to the test." He began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, dictating the terms as if he were negotiating a hostile takeover. "Here are the conditions. You will contact this man. You will arrange for him to be here tomorrow at noon. He will be screened by my security. He will be escorted directly to Ilara's room, and he will not deviate from that path. He is not to speak to anyone. He is not to touch anything. He gets exactly 5 minutes to play his instrument. I will time it myself on a stopwatch." He stopped directly in front of her, his eyes cold and hard as diamonds. "And nurse," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "here is the most important term. When the 5 minutes are over, and my daughter is exactly the same as she was before he began. Your employment here is terminated. You will have your final check and a non-disclosure agreement to sign, and I will expect you to be off my property within the hour. No arguments, no appeals. Do you accept these terms?" He expected her to hesitate, to bargain, to see the foolishness of her gamble. He wanted her to back down, to admit he was right. But Sarah didn't flinch. She simply looked at the powerful, broken man in front of her and gave the only answer her conscience would allow. "Yes, Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I accept." Noon. The next day arrived with a cold, unforgiving sunlight that did nothing to warm the grey stone of the Davenport mansion. True to her word, Sarah had made the call. And true to his character, Leo had agreed without asking about payment. He arrived not in a car, but on foot, having taken 2 buses to reach the iron gates that sealed the estate off from the rest of the world. He stood before the intercom, his old cello case in hand, looking not like an invited guest, but like a pilgrim who had arrived at the foot of a cold, lonely mountain. The gates opened with a silent, electric hum. A long, winding driveway led him to the front door, a massive oak portal that seemed more fitting for a cathedral than a house. The butler who opened it, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with a steel rod, looked at Leo's simple coat and worn shoes with undisguised disdain. He looked at the battered cello case as if it were a bag of garbage. "You are expected," the butler said, his voice as frigid as the marble floor of the foyer. He led Leo into the cavernous entrance hall, his own polished shoes clicking with authority, while Leo's footsteps seemed to make no sound at all. Richard Davenport was waiting for him. He stood at the base of a grand, sweeping staircase, a stopwatch held loosely in one hand. He was the king in his castle, and Leo was the court jester being brought in for a brief, unamusing performance. Standing a few feet behind him, her face pale with anxiety, was Sarah. She gave Leo a small, encouraging nod, a tiny island of warmth in a vast ocean of ice. Richard didn't offer a greeting. He didn't introduce himself. He simply began to speak, his words sterile and clipped, each one a brick in the wall of rules he was building around the moment. "You are here for one purpose," he said, his eyes scanning Leo from head to toe, dismissing him entirely. "You will be escorted to my daughter's room. You will have precisely 5 minutes. You will play your instrument. You will not speak. You will not touch anything. When the 5 minutes are concluded, you will be escorted out. There will be no payment beyond what Nurse Stevens might have foolishly promised you. Is that understood?" Throughout the condescending tirade, Leo remained perfectly still. He wasn't intimidated by the wealth that surrounded him. The cold glare of the powerful man in front of him didn't seem to register. His gaze was fixed on something beyond Richard, looking up the grand staircase. It was as if he could already see the room at the top, as if he could feel the person waiting there. He had walked into houses like this before, not mansions, but houses filled with a different kind of poverty, a poverty of hope. He recognized the silence in this place. It wasn't peace. It was the heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. When Richard finished his list of decrees, expecting a nervous gulp or a fumbling reply, Leo simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. That was it. No words, no protest. Just a quiet acceptance that seemed to rob Richard of his momentum. The king had delivered his royal proclamation, and the janitor had simply nodded, his mind already on the job he had come to do. Richard gestured curtly to the stairs. "Proceed." As Leo walked past him, Richard saw a beggar in his palace, a nuisance to be tolerated for a 5-minute experiment. He saw worn clothes and an old wooden box. But Leo wasn't looking at the gold, the art, or the man who owned it all. He was looking toward the silent room, and in the oppressive quiet of the house he heard a cry for help that no one else could hear. As Leo's worn shoes climbed the plush carpet of the grand staircase, he wasn't really in the Davenport mansion anymore. Each step upwards was a step backwards in his memory, into a different house, a different silence. The oppressive quiet of this place was painfully familiar. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence. It was the same hollow ache he had learned to live with years ago, a silence that had a weight, a texture, and a name. His name for it was Isabella. His wife, Isabella, had been a woman whose laughter could make flowers feel underdressed. She moved through the world with a vibrant energy that seemed to paint the air around her with color. But her light hadn't been extinguished in a sudden, violent crash of steel and glass. It had simply faded. A fog had rolled into the beautiful landscape of her mind, a deep and nameless sorrow that no doctor could diagnose and no medicine could burn away. She was there, but she was gone. She retreated into a silence so profound that Leo felt like he was shouting across a canyon just by whispering her name. In his desperation, when all words had failed, when touch seemed to bring no comfort, he had turned to the only language he had left, his cello. He would sit by her bed, in their small sunlit apartment that now felt like a tomb, and he would play. He didn't play concertos or famous pieces. He played what the silence felt like. He played the memory of her laughter. He played his own aching heart, his refusal to give up. The music became their only form of communication. It was a bridge built of notes thrown across the terrifying void that separated them. The music couldn't perform the kind of miracle the world demands. It didn't cure her, but it could reach her. On some days, a single low note would make a tear escape from her closed eye. On others, a soft melody would cause her fingers to unclench from the tight fist they had become. These were not victories a doctor could chart, but for Leo they were everything. They were proof that she was still in there, listening from the other side of the fog. The cello was not just wood and string, it was his hand reaching for hers in the darkness. It was his voice saying, "I am still here, I have not forgotten you." Isabella eventually lost her battle with the fog. The silence finally claimed her completely, and in the quiet that followed her departure, Leo made a promise. He promised her memory that he would keep playing. Not for applause in grand halls, not for coins in a case, but for the other silent ones, for the people lost in their own fog, whatever its cause. His music became a mission, a search for the echoes of life in the quietest rooms. So as he reached the top of the stairs and saw Sarah standing by a closed white door, he wasn't just seeing a nurse and a patient's room. He was seeing a reflection of his own past. He recognized the look in Sarah's eyes, that desperate cocktail of hope and fear. He knew the scent of antiseptic and the low electronic hum of the machines that lay on the other side of that door. He saw Isabella's face in the polished wood of the door. He felt her silence in the hallway's stillness. Richard Davenport thought he had hired a street performer for a 5-minute spectacle. He was wrong. He had opened his home to a man on a sacred quest. Sarah pushed the door open, and Leo stepped inside. The room was a contradiction, a battleground where two completely different worlds were locked in a silent, tragic stalemate. On one side was the world of Ilara, the girl who had lived here. Faded posters of bands on the wall, a shelf full of well-read books on art and poetry, a faint, lingering scent of lavender. On the other side was the world of her condition, the hospital bed with its metal rails, the IV stand with its clear bags of fluid, and the symphony of machines that breathed and beat for her. Their rhythmic electronic pulses were the only sign of life, a cold mechanical substitute for the real thing. And in the center of it all was Ilara. She was just as Richard had described, a sleeping beauty. But seeing her in person was different. There was a profound stillness to her that felt heavier than sleep. It was an absolute absence. Leo looked past the tubes and the monitors. He looked at her face, her long dark hair spread out on the white pillow. He saw the girl from the ghost-filled room, the girl who loved art, and the sound of a soul singing. Richard followed him in, planting himself in the doorway like a guard. His arms were crossed, his expression a mixture of impatience and grim satisfaction. He was a man waiting for a prophecy to fail. Sarah slipped into a corner of the room, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She was a woman waiting for a miracle. Leo didn't rush. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who understood that sacred things cannot be forced. He placed a simple wooden chair not facing the door, where Richard stood but facing Ilara, as if she were the only person in his audience. He unclasped the battered case and tenderly lifted the cello, its dark wood seeming to absorb the room's artificial light and give back a warm, organic glow. He sat, adjusted the instrument, and then he did something that seemed to infuriate Richard. He did nothing. He just sat there, his eyes on Ilara's face, his hands resting on his cello. He was listening, not with his ears but with his entire being. He was listening to the silence, learning its shape, its weight, its texture. He was attuning himself to the sorrow of the room. 1 minute passed. The only sounds were the soft whoosh of the ventilator and the steady, monotonous beep of the heart monitor. Richard's jaw tightened. He pulled the stopwatch from his pocket and made a deliberate show of clicking the button to start it. The sound was like a tiny, aggressive gunshot in the holy quiet. Another minute crawled by. Leo still hadn't moved. He simply breathed, in and out, slow, deliberate. His eyes were now closed. Richard's patience, a famously finite resource, snapped. "Is this part of the show?" he hissed from the doorway, his voice a blade of venom. "The 5 minutes are ticking away, musician." Leo gave no sign that he had heard. He was not in the room with Richard anymore. He was standing on the edge of the fog he knew so well, gathering his strength, preparing to step inside. He raised his right hand, the bow held delicately between his fingers. He let it hover over the strings, a breath away from contact. The silence in the room stretched until it was thin as glass, ready to shatter. The beeping of the machines seemed to fade into the background. The world held its breath. The room was thick with doubt, despair, and a single, fragile prayer. Leo lifted his bow, holding it over the strings. He wasn't a musician anymore. He was a doctor holding a scalpel, about to make the first, most critical incision into a year of absolute silence. Leo drew the bow across the strings. There was no grand flourish, no dramatic preamble. He simply gently made contact, and a sound was born into the sterile room. It wasn't a melody. It wasn't a song. It was a single note, a low, resonant C that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the cello. It wasn't loud, but it was immense. It filled every corner of the room, not with volume, but with presence. It was a sound you felt in your bones, a vibration that traveled up from the polished floorboards and into your very soul. The note was saturated with everything Leo had brought with him into that room. The memory of Isabella's smile, the ache of her absence, the quiet strength of his promise. It was a sound of profound, unshakable empathy. It spoke a single word in a language the soul understands. "I see you." For a breathtaking second, nothing happened. The note hung in the air, a perfect, mournful, hopeful thing. Richard Davenport's lip began to curl into the triumphant smirk he had been waiting to deploy. The experiment was failing just as he knew it would. His world of logic and data remained intact. And then it happened. Not with a shout, but with a whisper. On the primary monitor, the one Richard had stared at for thousands of hours, the electroencephalogram, the machine that drew the map of his daughter's silent mind, the line jumped. For 1 year, it had been a lazy, sluggish wave, a near flat line of cognitive stillness. But now, in response to that one single note, it spiked, a frantic, jagged peak in a long desert of nothingness. It was a flicker of lightning in a starless night. Richard's eyes locked onto the green line. His mind, the cold, calculating machine that ran his empire, immediately screamed anomaly, error, machine malfunction. It was a ghost in the data, a meaningless twitch. It had to be. He opened his mouth to voice his cynical dismissal, to point out the flawed technology. But the words never came, because Sarah let out a tiny, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes were not on the monitor. They were on Ilara's hand. Richard's gaze shot from the screen to his daughter's bed. He followed Sarah's stare to Ilara's left hand, which lay, as it always did, limp and pale on the white comforter, and he saw it, the index finger. It curled, a small, weak but definitive movement, a deliberate clenching, as if reaching for the note that still hung in the air. Time stopped. The rhythmic beeping of the machines faded into an irrelevant hum. Richard's entire body went rigid. The stopwatch fell from his numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the suddenly sacred space. His face, a moment ago a mask of arrogant certainty, completely crumbled. The cynicism, the anger, the pride, it all evaporated like mist in a sudden sun, leaving behind the raw, naked, stunned face of a father. The memory of his own cruel laughter from the day before echoed in his mind, the sound of a foolish stranger from a different lifetime. It was just one note, a single vibration in a silent room, but it was a shockwave that had just shattered a year of despair. The millionaire father had stopped laughing. The world had stopped spinning. For the first time in a very long time, he was truly listening. That first note was not an ending, it was an opening. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a year. And as it turned, Leo continued to play, letting the first note flow seamlessly into a second and then a third. He began to weave a symphony, not from a sheet of music, but from the very air in the room. It was a spontaneous, living composition, a conversation with a soul that was, against all odds, beginning to stir. The music told a story. It began with a low, mournful passage that spoke of the fog, of the long, lonely darkness. It acknowledged the pain and the silence. Then slowly, tenderly, it began to change. The notes grew lighter, more questioning. It was the sound of a hand reaching out, of a gentle voice calling a name from far away. It was a melody of encouragement, a path of sound being laid down, stone by stone, leading out of the wilderness. And Ilara began to walk it. With every new phrase from the cello, another monitor registered a change. The spikes on the EEG grew more frequent, more rhythmic. Her heart rate, once unnaturally steady, began to fluctuate, rising with the music's crescendos, settling with its softer moments. Her breaths, which for 365 days had been shallow and forced by the gentle push of the ventilator, began to deepen. She was fighting the machine, trying to claim her own lungs, to match her own rhythm to the cadence of the cello. Sarah watched the numbers, her medical mind reeling, her human heart soaring. This wasn't data. This was a resurrection. Then came the tear. It welled up from beneath her still-closed eyelid, a single perfect sphere of salt and water. It clung there for a moment before tracing a slow, clean path down her temple. It was a message from the other side of the silence. It was proof. She wasn't just reacting. She was feeling. The music had found her. That tiny drop of water did what millions of dollars and a legion of experts could not. It utterly broke Richard Davenport. He stumbled backwards and sank into a visitor's chair, his legs no longer able to support the weight of his collapsing certainty. His own eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. He was watching the most profound transaction of his life, and it had nothing to do with money. He looked at his daughter, at the tear tracking its way through the dust of a year of stillness, and he knew it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. More stunning than any sunrise over his private island, more precious than any painting on his walls. His gaze shifted to the man with the cello. Leo's eyes were still closed, his face a mask of intense concentration and empathy. He was pouring every ounce of his own history, his own love and loss for Isabella, into this music for a stranger. He was giving a gift that could not be bought, a gift of pure, undiluted humanity. In that moment, Richard saw not a street performer, not an experiment, but a healer, a master of an art he had never understood. He was witnessing a form of power, a kind of wealth that made his own empire look like a child's sandcastle. The symphony swelled to its peak, a triumphant, soaring melody of hope and light and return. It was the sound of a window being thrown open in a dark room. Then, as gently as it began, it softened, the notes growing quieter, slower, until a single final note hung in the air and faded away. The final note of the cello faded, but the music didn't vanish. It lingered, woven into the very fabric of the room. The silence that returned was not the heavy, oppressive silence from before. It was a new kind, a gentle quiet, pregnant with possibility. All eyes were on Ilara. Her breathing was her own, deep and steady. The tear had dried on her cheek, leaving a glistening trail, and then her eyelids, which had been sealed shut for a year, began to flutter. Slowly, hesitantly, they opened. Her eyes were hazy, unfocused, but they were open. For a brief, breathtaking moment, they moved, scanning the room before landing on the face of her father, who was now kneeling by her bedside. A small, weak sound escaped her lips, not a word, but a breath of recognition. And then her eyes closed again, not into the deep void from before, but into a true, healing sleep. The door had been opened. She was no longer lost in the fog. She was on her way home. Later, the doctors would come. They would be bewildered, checking their charts, running new scans. They would use words like unexplained neurological event and spontaneous recovery. They would write papers about her case, trying to find a scientific explanation for the miracle they could not deny, yet could never replicate. They would find no answers in their data. The answer was sitting quietly in the corner, holding a scarred cello. When they had gone, Richard, his face etched with a humility he had never known, approached Leo. He was a king who had lost his kingdom of certainty and, in doing so, had found something infinitely more valuable. He did the only thing his old self knew how to do. He reached for his checkbook. "Name your price," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its former power. "Anything you want. A new house, a new car, a foundation in your name. I will write a check for any amount. Just tell me what this is worth." Leo looked from the humbled billionaire to the sleeping girl, and a gentle smile touched his lips. He shook his head. "There is no price for this, Mr. Davenport," he said softly. "You can't buy a soul's return." He gestured with his bow towards the bed. "Hearing her breathe on her own, that was my payment. My only request is that you let me come back and play for her again." And so, a new routine was born in the house on the hill. The fortress became a sanctuary. 3 times a week Leo would arrive, no longer treated as a beggar or a repairman, but as the most honored guest. He would walk straight to Ilara's room, and Richard would be there waiting, not with a stopwatch, but with a cup of tea. He would sit and listen. He wouldn't check his phone or think about the stock market. He would just listen to the music and watch his daughter, who day by day grew stronger, her eyes staying open longer, a smile beginning to return to her face. The cold mansion began to feel like a home, warmed not by furnaces, but by the sound of a cello and the return of hope. Richard Davenport, the man who thought he owned the world, learned that true power isn't in a bank account but in an act of empathy. He learned that the most profound medicine doesn't always come in a pill, but sometimes in a melody. And he learned that you must never ever judge a person by the clothes they wear or the job they do, for you never know what priceless gift they hold inside them. He had laughed at the idea that a simple song could wake his daughter, only to find that a simple, honest song was the one thing that could also awaken him. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful life lessons every week.